Hi everybody. I'm in the natural area here at the San Diego Botanic Garden, and I want to highlight one of the coolest plants that's coming into its showy season right now. This plant beside me, chaparral yucca, also called Hesperoyucca whipplei. It's an outstanding plant that throughout much of the year you're barely going to notice it because it has just these fine rosettes of these narrow spine-tipped leaves, and they tend to be growing in the midst of dense chaparral, hence the common name chaparral yucca. But the plant itself is often kind of obscured by things like sages, artemisia, things like chamois, and all the other kind of cohorts of the chaparral and coastal sage scrub plant communities. But come this time of year, whether you're here in the garden or just moving around town, you're likely to see these giant cream-colored spikes of flowers coming out and maybe wondering what they are. So I wanted to tell you a little bit more about how amazing this plant is. Not only does it take years for these basal rosettes to grow and store enough energy to actually send up a big flower spike like this, they do tend to die after they bloom, very similar to agaves. And they've also been used by human cultures very similarly to agaves. So these plants produce a kind of a piña, very much like you'd see with an agave, and similarly they've been pit roasted, used for syrup distillation, and really importantly, this is a critical fiber plant for the indigenous cultures in our area. There'd be ways that you could essentially scrape away all of the kind of non-fibrous tissue and then kind of get these fibers to be a bit more malleable so that you can actually make these leaves into things like sandals, baskets, and so on. If the beauty of the flower spike, the durability and kind of amazing ability of this plant to just seemingly grow out of nowhere and show itself in this incredible flourish of blooms is not enough to excite you, let me tell you a little bit about some of the ecological life cycle of this thing. All of these flowers, the idea here is to produce fruit and seeds. And if you're only going to bloom once ever, or once in many years, or a decade or so, you really should try to get as much seed out of that one event as is possible. And this plant has a unique way of doing that. All of these flowers, they're very attractive to generalist pollinators because they're fragrant, they're big, they're beautiful, they open even throughout the day. But there's one bug, one insect, there's a moth that's the exclusive pollinator of this species. And it's an interesting study on how this plant and this insect have over many generations come to actually be reliant on one another for their continued existence. So each of these flowers is not only edible, beautiful, but very interesting in terms of symbiotic relationships. The moth comes up to these flowers, and not only does it grab pollen to move on to another flower, the moth actually lays its eggs in what will become the seed pod of this yucca. And with that, the pollination creates the seeds, but then there are larvae in those seed pods just as well. So somehow, over all these generations, this plant and that insect have come to a sort of tacit agreement where the moth provides the pollination services, and if not for that, the plant would have no seeds whatsoever. However, there's a trade-off, and in turn, the moth's progeny, the offspring, the larvae from those eggs, actually eat a portion of the seeds. So this thing is pollinated by an insect that only can use this species as its larval host plant, and it has this kind of give and take agreement without anything being written anywhere or expressed so concisely. But the only way that this yucca can continue to exist as such an amazing species throughout our region is by that one little moth's pollination services. And the only way that that moth can have future generations is if there are blooming chaparral yuccas as well. So when you're coming through this garden, or whether you're in the open spaces throughout the rest of the county, make note of what's going on around you seasonally, because by the time summer comes around, these flower spikes are going to start drying up and be gone and never come up from this same exact spot again.